All right, I'm Isaiah Maldonado here with Lyle Alenstein covering Penn State football. We're here in Beaver Stadium right after Penn State's 34-0 win over Florida International. We saw a lot of good things from this game, a lot of important things to touch on both offensive and defensive side of the ball. Let's get into the offense. It wasn't quite as dynamic this game. They went 3 for 12 total in terms of third down conversions. Kind of a struggle to get into the end zone, not necessarily to move the ball up the field, but towards the later end of the game, they were able to dominate. We saw a couple of really good plays with the 40-plus yard touchdown to Devontae Ross. We saw the early touchdown to Dinkins in the end zone. What did you think about this Penn State offense, Lyle?
Yeah, I think the first thing you just said was the third downs, and I think that was kind of the story James Franklin talked about at post-game. Really, when they can't convert, you can't move the chains like that, and, when they started to do that, it's when they started to score. But with the not being able to convert on third down comes not being able to score in the red zone. That was an issue last week for the Nittany Lions, with Ryan Barker having to hit 4 field goals, and, we saw some struggles in the red zone once again there today. But, it was a slow start offensively. Drew Allar did not look the part in the first half. He had throws that were behind receivers, had throws in front of receivers. He had some underthrown balls that could have been big chunk plays, but, they kind of turned it around. You look at that second half, it was a completely rejuvenated offense. Drew Allar, came out of the half, dialed back, and he talked about how he kind of felt like he held them all back offensively. And, but that second half, he looked the part once again. He just talked about it. Devontae Ross had that 41-yard touchdown, the first of his Penn State career. Coming off a week, he wasn't really involved in the offense. He only had one catch in his debut. But, they turned around. Nick Singleton had a touchdown cash in from 2 yards out. Kaytron Allen, big 67-yard run to end the game. Kind of put it to rest. Tale of two halves offensively, but, putting up 34 points, it doesn't really look good when you look at the stats, but nothing to complain about in that one.
I mean, listen, we're never going to complain about 409 total yards of offense. I think a really good thing for Penn State this game as well was you kind of spoke about them, or James Franklin spoke about their proven commodity being that running game. We mentioned this a little bit earlier last week. And this game, a very, very balanced offensive attack for both the rushing and passing attack. Over 200 yards rushing from both Kaytron and Singleton. They move up to 8 and 9 on the all-time rushing list. I think this is the offense that we need to see out of them in order for them to kind of build on these performances. I do think that once again, offensively, just from a numbers standpoint, they definitely looked better week one. But I think that this is a good first kind of look at a balanced offensive attack where they're not just playing into the passing game. They're going to challenge that 5 down or whatever forefront is going to be there and actually try and fight for those rushing yards. So I really like what I saw overall.
Yeah, I do have to say, last week we talked about Kyron Hudson, Trevor Pena, guys that stepped up. They both had a couple of catches in this one. But, getting Devontae Ross is big. James Franklin talked about this week. They wanted to get him more involved, and they did. He had 3 catches, 61 yards, and a score. We've now seen all 3 transfer wide receivers kind of do their thing. But, you mentioned it, Khalil Dinkins. Every time that guy catches the ball, it seems to be a touchdown. James Franklin stressed all off-season how he's going to be one of the more underrated players that no one's really talking about. He's quiet. I think he only had that 1 touchdown catch, but, continues to contribute as a run blocker. And then we saw Luke Reynolds, sophomore tight end. He had a handful of receptions. Kind of became a safety blanket for Drew Allar today. Obviously, last year, you're the other tight end with long hair and Tyler Warren, kind of being that guy putting up the Mackey Award numbers. But when you have all these guys that have flashed over the last 2 weeks paired with the running game, kind of getting more going today, you talk about that well-balanced offense. And, you talk to any of the guys, offensively, defensively, that anyone on this offense can hurt you any given day, especially with Andy Kolnicki kind of having a bunch of these guys getting rhythm in year 2. A couple of play calls today that, I thought were kind of questionable, especially when Drew was out of rhythm. You look at that, Kaytron Allen taking a direct snap, handed it off to Nick Singleton on a 3rd and 6 with Drew Allar split out wide when, Drew was kind of struggling. And I kind of point to last year where they kind of took Drew out of the game at times when he was kind of dialing in for Bo Pabula to run some of those trick plays. So kind of nitpicking there, but honestly, it was a kind of complete game offensively toward the later stages. We've seen a lot of those guys step up. Offensive line, kind of a revamped effort compared to last week, because when the run game succeeds, it starts up front. We saw all 7 of those aforementioned starters, our offensive linemen that we talked, all kind of get involved in the mix today. Vega Ioana and Anthony Donko both left briefly at times, had their helmet offs on the sideline, came back right in, obviously, but Cooper Cudgeon and TJ Sanahan, they view as starters. But honestly, you put that first half aside, complete effort offensively today.
Absolutely, but I think something that's kind of going underrated or not as recognized in terms of the offense really stepping up, they did it because the defense really allowed them to take their time to get into the end zone. James Franklin just spoke about this is the 5th consecutive year where they've shut out an opponent. First time since I believe it was the 60s that they've done that ever. So just that consistency from this Penn State defense, we're seeing it once again where they're being able to execute Jim Knowles' 4-2-5 system, and everybody looked complete in terms of the effort. We talk about Chaz Coleman, the Chazmanian Devil. just completely stuffed the stat sheet today. 4 total tackles, the tackles for loss, the strip sack, the fumble recovery, 39 yards, almost got himself a touchdown. And we just keep hearing people talk about how electrifying of an athlete he is. Everybody talks about his spin move and how he's able to get into the backfield at ease. What do you think his ceiling could be?
Oh, I don't really know. This guy is really good. And I think it's kind of crazy because he was a summer enrollee. Wasn't even a guy that kind of got here for that playoff run. But, man, Penn State offered him late last year, and I think it was August or September. Fought off a late push from Ohio State. You know, he is an Ohio native. But, man, that is really paying off right now. You saw it last week. Obviously, he's one of 2 guys that they're viewing as guys who they got the green light to burn that red shirt. But you saw it last week. You know, he was close to a pair of sacks, almost blocked a punt. In the first half today, you know, kind of was really close a few times at the beginning, but then he really tore it up. This is a guy post-game. Everyone on the field was coming up to congratulate him, giving him some embraces. You know, James Franklin talked about getting Zariah Fisher back today on that defensive end, a veteran presence to help him out. But, man, Chaz Coleman is going to be pushing him for that starting job this whole year. You talked about that spin move. You know, this was a guy that was a former, star on the basketball court in high school, and that spin move is translating. You know, that defensive line was kind of a question mark going into this season outside of, you know, those 2 starters and Dennis-Sutton and Zane Durant, who are going to be All-American candidates. Both have kind of looked the part so far in this early season. But that depth, you know, who's going to step up? Chaz Coleman has done really well. Alonzo Ford has got an interception today. Nye White, Texas A&M transfer, Philadelphia native, got his first sack today. James Franklin talked about how they, you know, you trust that depth, and, you know, it's really showing off today. But, you know, I think it kind of starts with those 2 starters in Zane Durant and Dennis-Sutton. But, man, you know, Chaz Coleman is having a freshman-level dominance that we haven't really seen in quite a few years.
Absolutely. And I think that's somebody where we're going to continue to hear his name for the next couple of years for Penn State. Don't even know what his ceiling could be. It really just seems that these defensive ends are kind of getting bred out of Penn State, but we love that. And the secondary also did their thing. Not a relatively stat-stuffing sheet day for them, but we saw a lot of people check in. Obviously, A.J. Harris, Woosley, the secondary as a whole with Belgrave, Shorter, and Sakeet Weekly. They're looking very comfortable out there. So once again, it goes back to being to execute that 4-2-5 system. And as a whole, the defensive unit is playing very in sync with each other.
Yeah, definitely. We've seen now 2 games with Jim Knowles, and, man, other than that garbage time touchdown late last week, it's been, you know, shutout ball from this club. They've been forcing turnovers, wreaking havoc. You see what the scheme can really do. They call him the scientist for a reason, but I don't even think he's really showcased a lot of that playbook yet. Obviously, he's still in this non-conference schedule, but they're really coming together. You talked about the secondary. I do want to highlight Sakeet Wheatley. There's one drive FIU was moving the chains, and he had 2 straight plays in a row where he saved a touchdown. He had a trip tackle, and then he had a PBU that got broken up. We've heard all offseason how this secondary is probably one of the strongest units on this team, probably in competition with that offensive line. Between those safeties, those corners that everyone's been rotating in, it's been really good. You know, you saw Belgrave Shorter getting a second straight start today, but King Mack, I thought, flashed defensively, had a pass breakup. I know the talk about him last week was, you know, that big kick return that he had. But, you know, I thought he did some good things. This was a guy who played his freshman year at Penn State, was expected to have a role as sophomore year, transferred to Alabama, came back, but, you know, he's kind of fitting right back in, not having that starting role, but he's doing some good things, and I just think this defensive unit is complete. I think Jim Knowles is unlocking something that we haven't really seen yet, but we're going to see later in the season. Honestly, it's just really complete stuff. You saw Zion Tracy, forgot to mention him. You know, you got their starting nickel corner back after not playing next week. You know, these pieces, they're all coming together. You're knocking on wood for Penn State because right now that health is pretty good, but, you know, the defense, Jim Knowles doing a great job.
Last thing we need to credit just the linebacker core. We touched on this last week about how to talk about them being potentially one of the weaker linebacker cores in the Big Ten. And what they did today, Amari Campbell and Tony Rojas combined for 19 total tackles, 3 tackles for loss. Their presence on the middle of the field and also just being able to get to the quarterback occasionally when they need to, like from every single level, from that front 4 to the middle to the secondary. This is a real complete defensive unit. So heading into this Villanova game next week, what do you want to see from Penn State before we get to the big game that everybody's talking about, Whiteout, Oregon?
Yeah, I think it's just, you know, clean up some things. That's what this non-conference schedule is about. Offensively, we touched on it earlier, cleaning up on third downs, get converted on red zone opportunities, kind of start fast. Obviously, you know, they scored on every single possession last week. Gabe Nwosu, we should talk about the special teams in a second.
Yes.
But, you know, I think starting fast is another big one. I think I saw shades of last year, week 2, where they started slow against Bowling Green, but then, you know, week 3 against Kent State, they kind of poured it on from the beginning. So I think we should kind of look for that in Villanova. Defensively, not a whole lot to complain about, honestly. We've seen complete football, you know, maybe like a few lapses here and there, and then honestly just complete games all around. But I do want to talk about special teams. We talked about Tony Rojas and Amari Campbell playing shutdown ball at linebacker, the pair of Virginia natives. But that third linebacker, Dom DeLuca, the three-time special teams captain, performing as well when they throw three linebackers on the field, had his third career block punt today at Penn State. This is three-time special teams captain who earned his spot as a scholarship guy from walk-on via his work on special. Just super cool to see, him really continuing to still strive on special teams, considering that's, how he made his name here at Penn State. And you saw Gabe Nwosu, that 6'7", 297-pound punter, who earned,
you heard that right, punter,
who earned the starting job for his first time as a redshirt senior. He's been in a reserve role as a kickoff specialist. Not really a reserve role, but that's all he's been doing, is kicking off. But, averaged 53 yards on his three punts today, had a 67-yard one. The 40-yarder one that was below the average got down to the 2-yard line. Franklin on Monday compared him to Jordan Stout, who's one of the better special, if not one of the top conversation of upper echelon special teams guys that have come across here at Penn State. And, he talked about we haven't really got to see what he did last week because, Penn State didn't punt. We saw what he did today. And, one of the big goals for this offseason is for that special teams unit ran by special teams coordinator Justin Lustig's second year. Just see all-around complete improvements. And, Devontae Ross as well.
Yes.
Punt return, got involved today. Didn't do one last week. Flash, broke up a couple big ones. This is really a complete team right now, I think. Heading into week 3 against Villanova, another tune-up game. But honestly, this team's firing on all cylinders.
For sure. You will catch us back here next Saturday for the Villanova game. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.